I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for everybody who loves stories about interesting people and events told by those who uncovered them from within their own family trees. This, we hope, will inspire you to discover and celebrate your history and your story. The name Benedict Arnold is almost always associated with being a traitor. In 1780, Arnold, who was then the commander of West Point, a strategic American fort on the Hudson River during the Revolutionary War, handed over military secrets to a British spy named Major Andre. However, Andre was captured and Arnold's treasonous act was discovered. While Andre was tried and hanged by the Americans, Arnold was able to escape and eventually fight for the British against his former comrades. Although widely known as a traitor, many people don't know that prior to defecting to the British, Arnold, who had risen to the rank of Major General, had fought bravely and with great distinction for the American Continental Army, and had been one of General George Washington's most valued officers. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we'll be speaking with award-winning author and historian Jack Kelly about his new book, God Save Benedict Arnold, the true story of America's most hated man. Jack will explain Benedict Arnold both as a hero and a traitor, and will help us explore the motivations of this complicated historical figure. I'd now like to welcome award-winning author and historian Jack Kelly. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you very much, James. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, so I'm very pleased to be speaking with you. So with my being from northern New Jersey, I've always been pretty much a stone's throw away from a lot of Revolutionary War history. I've actually heard New Jersey sometimes referred to as the military capital of the Revolution. But you are from New York, right, Jack?
Yeah, I live in the Hudson Valley, which is another area that saw a lot of action and a lot of strategic significance during the war.
Oh, yeah, for sure. As far as Benedict Arnold, the name Benedict Arnold is a name I've known for many, many years, even as a little kid. But one of the things that I remember is that it was always associated with something really, really bad. And somebody who turned on you.
Everybody knows one thing about Benedict Arnold, which is that he was a traitor. And part of my purpose in writing the book was to get across the idea that there's a lot more to Benedict Arnold than that one thing, though that one thing, I in no way try to exonerate him or to diminish the severity of his treason, but there was so much more to him, and that it's important to get a clear view of the Revolutionary War to understand how he fits into it. So I think really one of the most interesting characters in the Revolutionary era and in a way in American history in general is Benedict Arnold.
Oh, definitely. I even remember one of my favorite comedies was The Honeymooners. I'm sure you remember that one, where Ralph Cramden felt that Ed Norton had turned against him and he called him, "You Benedict Arnold."
Yeah, it became a synonym for treason, and you still see it today in cartoons and references. He's a Benedict Arnold. Everybody knows what it means. But one of the things I found interesting is that Benedict Arnold was an extreme example of a type of person of which there were a number of during the Revolutionary era and also later, of these paradoxical figures that seemed to go both ways. They had sympathy for the king, but they also had sympathy for the cause, and they would veer back and forth during the course of the war. And people like Ethan Allen, for example, or Aaron Burr, or General Charles Lee, who is not a well-known figure in the Revolution now, but was very prominent early in the war, and had his doubts and had his conflicts. Benedict Arnold wasn't just totally unique, but he just took it a lot farther than anybody else did. And I think looking down in history, you see, people like John Brown. Was John Brown a good person or a bad person? it's hard to tell. He had conflicting ideas and conflicting actions throughout his life.
I know sometimes you hear about rankings of presidents by presidential historians throughout the years, and you'll notice sometimes how that ranking changes in time, because of the same reasons that there were different things that they did.
That's a good point. And Andrew Jackson, of course, being one of those, was at one time considered a huge hero. And then issues of slavery and his relations with the Indians. Now he's in the outs. And even Thomas Jefferson. I mean, Thomas Jefferson is a great man, but he was a slave owner. And so one of the things I really love about history is the fact that it's constantly evolving, and it's a dynamic thing. It's not just a list of facts from the past.
Oh, I love it. I love it. There's so many things that are being revealed as there's more information seems to be available digitally, and making for some historians easier work in some cases. Sometimes you got to roll up your sleeves and really dig into the old archives. I can imagine you've done that. And
yeah.
It can become new. History is not old. It's new because you discover so many new things. I thought what we could do is I'm going to ask you a few questions to take us through the book. By the way, wonderful book, God Save Benedict Arnold, the true story of America's most hated man. Let's start off with Benedict Arnold's background. I understand that he came from a very old family in New England, and that they had some money at some point in time, didn't they?
Yeah, my book is not primarily a biography of Arnold, but I do go into his background a little just to give some context. And his going back 4 generations, his grandfather and everybody in the family was named Benedict. In the Arnold family, it was passed down to him, and he passed on to his son. His great-great-great-grandfather had been the governor of Rhode Island and was a very wealthy man. And the family fortune got sort of diluted as it came down the line. His father was not wealthy to begin with, but he married well. He did well in business, and he became very successful. And he was largely just a merchant trader who had his own ships and would go down to trade mostly in the West Indies. And Benedict Arnold was, and I emphasize this fact to people, was a seaman. He went with his father on sea voyages. Father was captain of the ship, and had a pretty exciting childhood for a while. His father then became an alcoholic, and the business went down. He couldn't keep up the business. He became like the town drunk, a big disgrace for the family. His son, Benedict Arnold, was sent out to find his father in a tavern, to find him lying along the street and bring him home. A very searing duty for a 12, 13-year-old kid. And that failure of the family business and the fact that he had to drop out of school, had to become an apprentice, was a major factor in sort of shaping Benedict Arnold's view of the world and his sensitivity to any slight to his honor. So that factor, I think, stayed with him. And the other big factor from his childhood that was important was that his mother was a Puritan Calvinist, and had the real hardcore Calvinist view of death. And we should always be aware of death and always be ready to lose your life. And she knew what she was talking about because she lost like 3 children to epidemics. It was very common in those days. And she kept emphasizing to Benedict Arnold, be aware that you're going to die and be ready to die. And I think that had an impact on him, even though he was not himself that particularly religious, not religious at all, as far as we know, but kept that idea in his head.
Before he got involved in the War for Independence, he did become successful as a businessman himself, didn't he?
Yes. He's often referred to as an apothecary because he did sign on with some relatives of his mother who had an apothecary shop in eastern Connecticut. But an apothecary in those days, first of all, was more of a general store, sort of a high-end general store. They sold medicine, but they also sold books, and they sold jewelry and just a lot of high-end items. But the firm that he worked with, that was apprenticed to, was also a trading company, and they had an international trading business to the West Indies, to England, to Canada. And when he finally got through with his apprenticeship, he set up his own business, and they helped him. They helped bankroll his business, and he started an apothecary shop in New Haven, but was also immediately getting into trading. Bought his own sailing ships and cargo ships, so very widely traveled and quite successful. He had the biggest house in New Haven in his 30s, and married and had 3 sons, and was at the beginning of the revolution was a successful businessman who basically abandoned his life at that point to join the fight against the British.
While he had some experience on ships, he didn't have anything really substantial as far as military training or experience when the War for Independence broke out, did he?
Yeah, I always point though to the fact that he was a ship's captain. In those days, many of the skills that it took to be a ship's captain really could be transferred over to being a military officer. You had to have a sense of command. You had to dominate people because you were out in the high seas where your own crew could mutiny. Benedict Arnold developed these skills, I think, of command and having a sense of dominating his subordinates that he quickly transferred over to his military thing, because he had virtually no military training and immediately jumped into the war, and immediately within weeks was a colonel in the Continental Army. So
it's so incredible when you read about the American Revolution, those people who came in command who were doing very different things before, like Henry Knox, well known as the one who brought the cannons from Ticonderoga across to the Berkshires for Washington to beat them down on the British in Boston. He was a bookseller, I think.
Yeah, I always find him a very interesting character, and it does seem to us very incongruous that a bookseller would jump in and become a military officer. But the one thing that we have to remember is, as far as information goes, he had access to information from the books he had that most people couldn't afford, of military theory and strategy. And he read voraciously about military theory. So he had at least that basic structure to apply this, his military experience to, from having read all the books about warfare and the advice of generals from Europe.
Incredible. That it is. Information Central was the local bookshop, right? Not the internet.
Exactly.
So obviously Benedict Arnold he got into this pretty quickly when he heard about what happened at Lexington and Concord, and there'd been a clash between the colonials and the British, and he got involved pretty quickly. So he ended up forming a unit. He was the head of a unit. And what happened then? How did he actually dive in quickly into that war?
When the news of Lexington arrived in New Haven, I think it was 2 days later, he wanted to move immediately. And they called out the militia. They weren't really ready. They didn't all have muskets. He recruited some Yale students to sign up with the militia as well. So he went to the town fathers and asked for the keys to the powder house, which is where it was their arsenal. And they weren't ready to commit. They said, well, we don't know what happened in Lexington, Massachusetts. Let's wait until we get the real story or the more news comes about. And he said, no, we're going to march today. And so he demanded the keys to the powder house, which was the arsenal for where they kept their muskets and gunpowder. And the town fathers were not ready to commit to the revolution exactly yet. They wanted to get more information, but Arnold threatened to break open the powder house and take the weapons they needed. So they gave him the keys, and he then marched immediately with the militia company towards the siege of Boston, which was going on immediately after Lexington. And it's interesting that action is celebrated in New Haven every year now on what they call Powder House Day in April. I think it's April 22nd or something.
How cool is that?
Yep.
Yeah. So right here, just to pause for a second now. I listened to a lecture that you gave at the New York State Museum. And you referred to your book more as, instead of a biography, it's more of a Benedict Arnold's greatest hits.
Yeah,
You said, so to pause here to say that here's this person that history is pretty much treated, he is a traitor, he's the worst of the worst, and that's how how he's going to be remembered. But what you're starting to say here is this guy's a pretty daring, all in to this fight against Britain. And that's what we're hearing. So we're starting to hear his life roll out as far as this war and how much he's willing to invest his talents into this war, right?
right. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go on from there then. So he does get up to Massachusetts, but then I think he's given a larger command at that point.
Yeah, when he got to Massachusetts in Cambridge, which was where the militia were besieging the British who were inside the city, he met Joseph Warren, who was really the radical firebrand of the revolution in Massachusetts. And they were like had a mind meld. They were like had exactly on the same wavelength, and both very radical. Both of them knew that the war had to be pursued. Warren got him a commission as a colonel in the Massachusetts militia. There was no Continental Army yet at that point, and sent him out to Western Massachusetts to recruit men to take over Fort Ticonderoga, which was Benedict Arnold's idea that they was both a strategic location and a source of artillery, because the Patriots had very little artillery, and there were a lot of stored guns in Fort Ticonderoga up on Lake Champlain. So Arnold immediately rode as fast as he could across the entire state of Massachusetts and got out there and eventually got up into the fight for Fort Ticonderoga.
And they capture the fort.
He captured the fort. The British, the news of Lexington and Concord hadn't reached Ticonderoga yet. It had to go up through Canada and then down through the couriers. And so they were totally unaware that there was anything going on. And they caught them asleep. And Benedict Arnold had teamed up with the Green Mountain Boys, which was a vigilante group up in what is now Vermont, but was then disputed territory between New York and New Hampshire. And Ethan Allen, who was the head of these Green Mountain Boys, though Ethan Allen is sometimes given the credit for taking over Ticonderoga, it was really Benedict Arnold had a much better sense of leadership, of what needed to be done. And in particular, as soon as they took over the fort, he sailed up to Canada and captured a sloop of war, which was the only British warship on Lake Champlain. So that gave the Patriots control of Lake Champlain, which was crucial for holding on to Fort Ticonderoga and for thwarting the British strategic objective early in the war, which was to come down that Lake Champlain, which allowed them to connect to the Hudson River and come all the way down to New York. And they wanted to split the colonies by controlling what was, in those days, was kind of the superhighway of the colonies. There was a waterway that ran from Montreal all the way down to New York City. And the Patriot control of Ticonderoga is what prevented them from doing that.
Two very big contributions there that had big ramifications. Obviously, the cannons from Ticonderoga were used. Ultimately, also the British not having like free sailing in the waterways there, kept them from really cutting off the northern colonies or the New England colonies, I should say. So we got these big initiatives he's taking. Is he rising in rank too at this time?
Well, there was really a tremendous amount of confusion at that time, because who was in control of this revolution that was just getting underway? And that was a big dispute. Who was going to pay for it? And so he had his credentials from Massachusetts as well as from Connecticut. Connecticut then sent a force of men up to help man Ticonderoga with an officer who was supposed to take over, but they then had the clash between, was Massachusetts in charge or was Connecticut in charge of a fort that was actually in New York? In New York, it was very slow to get up to speed during the Revolution. Congress wanted to give the fort back originally. They thought it would prevent a reconciliation with Britain, which is what they wanted early in the war. So there was a lot of confusion as to who who was in control, which led to hard feelings and disputes, and eventually to Arnold resigning his commission there and going home. So it was largely just the lack of clear command before they got the Continental Army in place.
Yeah. Now, Benedict Arnold, his resignation didn't last long, did it?
No, he immediately went back to Boston, where by this time George Washington was now in charge and was starting to take the militia forces there and shape them into a Continental Army. And Arnold had proposed, and other people had the idea as well, an invasion of Canada. And the Congress, though reluctant at first, had come around and decided, yeah, that we'll send a force up into Canada. It made a lot of strategic sense, but it was not ultimately a success when they tried to pull it off. But they were going to send one force up from Lake Champlain from Ticonderoga, and Washington assigned Benedict Arnold to take another army and go up into Maine and go over the mountains of Maine to attack the city of Quebec. That was a very daring move. Nobody had really knew of any roads up there. There were trails through the woods that had been originated by Indians, and very few maps. And yet Arnold took a 1,000-man army with all their supplies. That they weren't able to take cannon because they couldn't take cannon. They put their supplies in these what they call white man's canoes, like hammered together boats, and went up the Kennebec River. And that was considered one of the most amazing military expeditions in history. It's the hardships that they ran into through no fault of their own. It was just a matter of it was much more difficult than they thought it was going to be. They had brought excess food along, but a lot of the food was spoiled, or it got spoiled on the way because of the water getting in the boats. They didn't really row the boats up the river. They essentially pushed them wading through the ice water. Tough going, ran out of food. And Arnold really proved his leadership in that expedition, because it was the lives of those men were on the decisions that he made, and he did eventually get them over the mountains and down, almost captured Quebec, but it was a fortified city. He didn't have the cannon to knock the walls down, so he had to wait for the other end of the expedition, which was just coming up the St. Lawrence River, and it didn't turn out well.
And I think one of the objectives really to bring the war into Canada and have gained the support of the French Canadians there against the British. Was that the
yeah they figured that the French would be eager to join them, having the resentment of the British. They had only been under the control of the British for a dozen years at that point. The British had taken over Canada, but the French were reluctant to take sides. That was a big factor. They thought they could get quite a few fighters from the French population along the St. Lawrence, and they just didn't want to commit themselves to one way or the other. So they knew that there would probably be reinforcements that would be sent over in the spring, and that's the way it turned out, in addition to a smallpox epidemic that broke out among the troops there. But they did make the attempt during a snowstorm at the end of December to storm Quebec. Benedict Arnold was under a subordinate then to General Montgomery, who was in command. And Montgomery's plan to storm the city walls just didn't work. And Montgomery was killed, and Benedict Arnold took over. But by that time, they lost a large part of their force and had just a skeleton force up there. And in the spring, of course, the British reinforcements arrived, and they had to get out as quick as they could.
So when you think about what Arnold was tasked to do, his military achievements are in many cases lost to history until we read books like yours. What an effort to get, however it was, 1,000 men through all that terrain and and to attack and not knowing what's going to happen when they attack. Are they going to get annihilated or what have you? Just a hardship. And then, of course, dealing with disease and lack of provisions and not having cannons. So this guy's got a lot of gumption, hasn't he?
Yeah, and I think again we see that admonition from his mother, be prepared to die. It was really, I think it was true of a lot of the fighters in the revolution that you had no doubt that you were risking your life. And Arnold was smart about the way he did it, but he was a very daring person.
Yeah, I think he got a flesh wound, some kind of a wound at Quebec.
When they tried to storm the city, he did get shot in his calf, and it was painful, but it was not fatal, and he recovered fairly quickly and really held command there for a number of months. And he kept asking for a senior officer to be sent up to take over, and they just didn't have anybody to send. And sort of a siege of a sort went on throughout the winter, but the troops got sicker and sicker. And as soon as they saw the British reinforcements arrive, they all headed down to St. Lawrence to get back into the colony. So
I know there's such great details in your book about these events, but just to go real quickly through a couple others, no less important, but we'll start with at Lake Champlain. Arnold utilized his naval experience at a place called Valcour, and you've written a book about this, right?
Yeah, that was one of my avenues for interest in Benedict Arnold, was writing the book about the battle of what they call the Battle of Valcour Island, which was during the very crucial year of 1776. George Washington was fortifying New York City. They had forced the British out of Boston. The British were sending a massive army over, partly to New York, partly to Canada. And the force in Canada was intended to come down that water corridor of Lake Champlain, Lake George, Hudson River. Benedict Arnold was not in command, but he was sort of second in command to General Gates, who was at Fort Ticonderoga. Gates had no nautical experience, and so all of the naval aspect of the defense of Ticonderoga fell onto Benedict Arnold. They built gunboats. They built some small sailing vessels with cannon on them. And then he went up to the north end of Lake Champlain to meet the British, who were building a much bigger fleet and had all the resources of the Royal Navy behind them to come down the lake. But the British had to have those warships in order to protect their troops as they sailed down the lake. So it took week after week after week, and it got into October before the British finally decided to sail down Lake Champlain. Benedict Arnold had placed his fleet in a little bay between Valcour Island, which is about a mile off the New York shore. It was protected from the weather and also hidden from the British. And the British came down on October 11th. They fought a battle in that bay. Arnold had a really brilliant strategy of fighting from anchor. So he knew the British were much better at sailing their ships and maneuvering their ships. So his ships were just sat there in a line in anchor, and they swung them back and forth to shoot from one side and then the other side. A very brutal form of warfare went on for 7 hours, and then it got dark and the Americans were still standing. But they were then vulnerable because they'd used up most of their ammunition. So Benedict Arnold came up with a plan to escape. And it's almost like a fairy tale. They were able to escape through the British blockade of this much bigger fleet and head down the river, down the Lake Champlain. There was more fighting farther south on Lake Champlain. Most of the American fleet was destroyed. But by the time the British then got their army down to Fort Ticonderoga, it was too late in the season to start a siege. They were afraid of the lake freezing behind them, which would have trapped them there. And so they decided, we'll go back to Montreal and try again in the spring. So that campaign in 1776 in the north was a complete success. And if you look at the other end of that corridor, that water corridor, the campaign waged by George Washington in and around New York City was a complete failure. George Washington lost the Battle of Brooklyn, the largest battle of the entire war. He was forced out of New York City, eventually forced to cross New Jersey, ended up on the far side of the Delaware River in Pennsylvania. He had started out with a 20,000-man army. He was down to 3,000 men. And he wrote a letter to his brother, and he said, I think the game is pretty near up. And if he had had to also contend with an invasion coming down the Hudson River, I think it would have been curtains for him. But instead, Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates brought more than 600 men down from Fort Ticonderoga that were no longer needed there because the British had gone home, and they joined Washington's army in Pennsylvania. So some of the men who fought at Valcour Island also crossed the Delaware with George Washington on Christmas night and fought in, it was really his most spectacular battle at Trenton. Benedict Arnold was not one of them because he'd been sent off on another assignment, but he certainly could take a lot of credit for what happened during that campaign and the way that Washington was able to revive Patriot hopes by attacking the British at Trenton.
There you go again. Benedict Arnold is involved in something very big for the cause of independence at that point. So I know there were other engagements that he had during his military career with Washington, but let's talk about this really super significant Battle of Saratoga in September of 1777 and Benedict Arnold's involvement in that battle.
Yeah, ironically, Benedict Arnold had gone to Philadelphia in the summer of 1777 to resign, and he'd handed in his resignation. He thought he should have got more promotion than he'd gotten. Junior officers had been promoted over his head, and he was just generally disgruntled with Congress. And Congress at that time controlled all of the promotions of the major officers. Benedict Arnold handed in his resignation from the Continental Army. The same day that he handed it in, the news arrived that Fort Ticonderoga had been taken by the British. The British had finally gotten that invasion that they wanted down that corridor. General John Burgoyne had 7,000-man army, a very heavy train of artillery. And Arnold forgot all about his resignation, jumped on a horse, rode up, joined General Gates, who was in command then. They decided to meet General Burgoyne on the high ground a few miles south of the village of Saratoga, which was along the Hudson River, north of Albany. They fought two battles there, which collectively are called the Battle of Saratoga. In both battles, General Burgoyne tried to sweep around the left end of the American lines. In both battles, Benedict Arnold was in command of the left division. In the first battle, he really fought Burgoyne to a standstill. And in the second battle, he decisively defeated Burgoyne and led a charge into the British field fortifications that broke through and put Burgoyne in a position where he had to do what he said he would never do, which was to retreat. Benedict Arnold was severely wounded in that battle in the same leg he'd earlier been shot in the fight around Quebec, but this time it shattered the bone in his leg. But General Burgoyne, 10 days later, surrendered his entire army to General Gates in what is often referred to as the turning point of the Revolutionary War that brought the French into the war and really did change the complexion of the war.
That is incredible. I mean, that was a severe injury that really caused him a permanent disability, didn't it?
Yes, they think it's not even clear exactly what the wound was. They didn't go into describing them at that time, but they think that it hit his shin bone and shattered his shin bone. That would normally be a cause for amputation, but Arnold refused amputation and was able to recover, but it was with a very bad limp for the rest of his life and lived through a lot of pain. You know, you can imagine those days before pain relief was in a very primitive state.
So here we go. We've gotten a lot of these successes and other things, of course, that he was involved in, but I'm going to fast forward to 1780. Before we go any further, just to set the stage, we're going to talk about some of the reasons why we think Benedict Arnold became a traitor. But let's start with the day that this all broke loose, what was the plan that Arnold had with Major Andre and the British to sell out, in effect?
Well, once he decided to switch sides, he wanted the biggest bang for his buck, let's say. And he got command of the lower Hudson Valley, which included West Point, which in those days was not a military academy. It was a fort that really controlled the access to the Hudson River. And he agreed to, with the British, that he would give over the fort. He would allow them to capture the fort. So in September of 1780, he met with Major Andre in neutral ground down along the Hudson River. He gave him a map of the fort, told him the best way to attack, the troop deployments, gave him a pass so that he could move around through American lines. And then Benedict Arnold went home, and Major Andre was intending to go back to New York, where the British headquarters was. And he was very excited, and he was very nervous. He was excited because he had really pulled off the biggest intelligence coup of the war that was going to totally make his career. And he was nervous because between the American lines and the British lines, there was a no man's land that was basically Westchester County. And he knew that there were both loyalists and patriots patrolling, the militia patrolling in the area, and he was in civilian clothing. So he got down to almost to Tarrytown, which is fairly a good way down towards the British lines. He was stopped by 3 militiamen. They pointed their muskets at him. He made the mistake of saying, "I hope you're of our party." And so one of these militiamen, who was not so dumb, said, "Oh yeah, what party is that?" And then Major Andre had to guess. He said, "The lower party," meaning the British. And the militiaman said, "We're Americans, get down." They got him off his horse. They searched him. They found the documents that Arnold had given him. They took him to their commanding officer, Colonel Jameson. And I think Colonel Jameson was a little slow on the uptake, because Colonel Jameson sent a letter to his commanding officer, who was Benedict Arnold, describing the suspicious activity that had taken place down near Tarrytown. And then Jameson had second thoughts about it, and he decided to get in touch with George Washington as well. And the real twist in this whole plot was that George Washington was not in the American camp, but had been over in Hartford, Connecticut, meeting with French officers, was on his way back, and was going to have breakfast the next morning at Benedict Arnold's house with Arnold and his wife. And then it was going to go over and inspect the fortifications at West Point. So you have the case where Washington is approaching from the north. 2 couriers are approaching from the south, unbeknownst to each other, because the second courier then had found out that that's where Washington would be. Washington's aides arrive at Arnold's house. The general's just up the road. He'll be here in a few minutes. Arnold, at that point, gets the first letter from the courier. He tells his wife, "I've got to get out of here." And he said, "Tell Washington, I'm going over to West Point. I'll be back. Just wait here for me." Washington arrives. Arnold's not there. He's over at West Point. "Well, let's go over and do the inspection now." So Washington and his whole entourage goes over to West Point. They begin to look around, and the fortifications were in poor shape. They had not been rebuilt as they were supposed to. There weren't enough men there. He said, "Where's Benedict Arnold?" They said, "Well, we haven't seen him in 2 days." Washington later described his own thinking. He said, "My mind misgave me." He said, "I didn't suspect the real cause, though." And it's that type of feeling of like, there's something very wrong here, but I don't know what it is. He went back to Arnold's house, was going to take a nap. The other courier arrived. Washington immediately knew what the story was. He called in his most trusted subordinate, Henry Knox. He said, "Arnold has betrayed us. Who can we trust now?" And that wasn't a rhetorical question, because Washington at that point didn't know how far this plot went and who was involved. So he sent Alexander Hamilton riding down to try to catch up with Arnold, alerted the army to send troops up to protect West Point. And then there was another form of drama evolved as Benedict Arnold's wife started pulling her clothes off and having a hysterical fit. And these officers didn't suspect that a woman could be so devious that she was actually in on the plot all along and was trying to help her husband escape. But that was the case, and he did escape and went over to the British in New York.
So she was doing more of a smokescreen, I guess, to try to buy time for her husband doing
Absolutely.
things. Oh, that is crazy. So Benedict Arnold does escape, doesn't he?
Yes, and I think his plot to give over West Point is usually the focus of what people know about his treason. But he went on to become a brigadier general in the British Army, went down to Virginia, fought quite well, actually, down there in spite of his leg, and then was given the assignment to raid the city of New London. And he took a force up there, burnt part of the city. There was a fort that they took over, and there was a massacre after the takeover, which Arnold was not involved in, but he was the commander. This was only a few miles from his hometown. So there was almost like a psychological factor there. And then after Yorktown, he went over to England and never came back.
Yeah, and he did all right financially after he defected, right? And he was a good businessman even over in England. So it wasn't like he went broke and ended up in a gutter somewhere.
Right. I don't think he was a happy person after. He was not really accepted in Britain because even though he had helped the British cause, nobody likes a traitor. But you're correct. He did fairly well in business. He was always an astute businessman, had gotten a fair amount of money from the British government, as did his wife, Peggy, got a stipend from the British for her help in the plot. And his sons all went into the British Army and did quite well as well. But he always wanted to get back in the action. And the British weren't about to put him in a position of command once he'd come over there.
Yeah. So part of the arrangement for giving over the plans to West Point was financial. I mean, there was a financial part of it. I understand he didn't get quite what he would have gotten had it been successful, but he did get something.
Yeah, there was talk about they had agreed to 20,000 pounds, which was a huge fortune in those days, if he was able to go over West Point. And I think he got 6,000 pounds, which was still a very substantial amount of money. But people say, well, he only did it for the money, but he probably, and I think he probably understood that if he'd stuck it out, continued his business in America, he would probably have done better financially. And he knew that once he went over to the British, he was giving up his commission, his salary, his business, all his contacts. So he thought it was only fair that he should get compensated for it. That was his view.
Yeah, definitely. So just to back up our poor Major Andre, he was tried, right? And hanged.
Yes. Originally, George Washington tried to arrange an exchange. They would give Andre back in exchange for Arnold, who they would then hang. But General Clinton, who was the British commander then, wanted to encourage people to defect. They had arranged for this major defection by Arnold. And if he gave a defector back to the Patriots, that would have ended all defections. So he did realize that was not a possibility, and he allowed Major Andre to go to his death. It happened very quickly afterwards.
It did. I've done some reading on Andre. There's just a little side note. One of our earliest episodes, we interviewed the owner of the old 76 house in Tappan, New York. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but that was Major Andre's cell where he was imprisoned right before his hanging. And if you go to that restaurant, you'll see over the fireplace in the dining room is a picture of Benedict Arnold, but it is hanging upside down. And it's purposely hung upside down.
There was a lot of sympathy for Andre, because the American officers felt that, well, he was just doing his duty. He was doing what a soldier should do. Yeah, he shouldn't have taken off his uniform because that really made him a spy rather than a military officer. But he was trying to accomplish what a soldier should try to accomplish for his side. And so that they felt that it was too bad that he had to be the one to pay the price, whereas Benedict Arnold, who had committed such treachery, would be allowed to live. George Washington did try to kidnap Arnold and had a plot afoot in New York before Arnold left for Virginia to fight down there. And they almost were able to get hold of him, and he would have been hanged if that had been the case, but they missed their chance and didn't get another one.
Yeah. So let's just talk about some of the motivations we think could have been there for Arnold. I think we've touched a little bit about finances. What are some of the common go-tos as far as what people have come up with ideas as to why he made this big change in his allegiances?
Well, it seems like everybody has their favorite theory as to why the reasons for Benedict Arnold's defection. What intervened before he decided to switch sides was that he had been put in charge as an administrator because he was laid up with his leg. He was made an administrator in Philadelphia after the Americans took Philadelphia back. The British had actually abandoned it after capturing it in 1777. They left in 78, and Arnold was put into charge of sort of a martial law in Philadelphia while the civilian administration was being put back in place. And there were quite a few loyalists in Philadelphia who would cooperate with the British. A lot of the wealthier people of Philadelphia were sort of on the fence. They didn't totally commit as loyalists, but they weren't very ardent patriots either. Arnold tended to associate with them as a wealthy man himself. He liked to associate with people that had money and gave parties and dinners, and came under the sway of Peggy Shippen, who was the daughter of a very prominent loyalist leaning. He wasn't exactly a loyalist, but he was a loyalist leaning family there. And Arnold's first wife had died during the war, and he was looking for a wife, and he married Peggy Shippen, was half his age. She was 19 and he was 36. And some people point to that as she then influenced him. I think that seems improbable. She knew Major Andre, and she did serve as a go-between, but I think it's improbable that she really had much to do with a 19-year-old young woman. However politically astute she was unlikely that she was the cause of making him commit to this major decision in his life. Some say it was the money was the major cause. Arnold himself wrote a letter very soon after he went over to the British, and he listed in there that he didn't like the French. He didn't like the alliance with the French. He never really wanted independence. And various other reasons for his going over to the British that really come off as excuses more than imagining that actually motivated him to do that. And it turned out that letter wasn't even written by him. It was written by a British administrator who was simply listing a lot of the loyalist arguments for being against the revolution. And none of them really rang true. I think, he knew what the alliance with the French was all about. It was crucial for Americans to keep the war going. He knew most of his military feats were after the Declaration of Independence, so it couldn't have been that was the problem. So my own answer to why he committed treason was, I don't know. And the one speculation that I make in the book, and I go into all the factors in the book, but I really think that Arnold was such an enigma. It's very hard to say, yes, that's the reason. But one of the factors which I talk about is that he was always addicted to action. He loved to be in the action. When he was in battle, when he was in a crucial situation, he always seemed to operate very smoothly, very intelligently. When he was idle, he tended to get in trouble. He had rubbed people the wrong way. He didn't have a good sense of being diplomatic in his relations with other military officers. And he was, in a way, I think, addicted to this action to the point where when he was laid up, he started thinking too much. He started imagining things that, how things could go. And even perhaps, and I certainly don't have any evidence for this, but even the thrill of being a traitor was a factor for him, because he knew as soon as he made contact with the British, he was a marked man. If any word had slipped out of the British headquarters, Benedict Arnold is our agent, he would have been taken and lost everything and been hanged. That was a kind of thrilling situation for him, for a guy who's now laid up because of his leg. Was that a factor? I don't know, but it's something to think about.
I also know that throughout the book, there's indications of his being very thin-skinned and things bothered him a lot. So maybe when he was in that laid up condition, he was just thinking about all the things that were making him upset about Congress, or mostly maybe his own lack of adrenaline that he was getting from being laid up. It's possible,
Yeah, I think that's very true. And the sense of honor, which was a big deal in a way that is hard to imagine now, it was a very big deal in the fighting duels and, you've insulted me. Arnold took that to an extreme, really. He didn't fight a lot of duels. He did do a few of them, but he didn't take criticism well.
So if I could get a cameraman to go back to the day that both Arnold and Washington found out that what had happened, when Arnold read that letter from Jameson that Andre had been apprehended, I can see the look on his face. And then versus the look on Washington's face when he realized one of his most trusted officers had betrayed him. Because Washington was a pretty big supporter of Arnold's, wasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. He had loved Arnold, both, I think personally he was very fond of him and knew how valuable he had been to the cause and how valuable he was. And I always point out that William Shakespeare wrote a lot of plays about history, but history sometimes seems to create its own dramas, which seem so improbable, and yet it was like a playwright had written that. The whole incident of how Benedict Arnold's treason was unwound.
So, Jack, what prompted you to write this book now?
Well, James, I think that really there's a number of reasons behind writing any book, I suppose, but one of them is that Benedict Arnold is a great conduit into the revolution, into the whole story of the revolution, because he's one of the most well-known revolutionary soldiers, probably second only to George Washington. And I thought that it's both an inspiring tale, but also a cautionary tale. And I sometimes refer to it as history for adults. It's not the Parson Weems, I chopped down the cherry tree, now I must tell the truth. This is history, as we know, in fact, like life, it's full of contradictions, it's full of conflicts. And so Benedict Arnold has all of that. And I think is a cautionary tale is that we have to look at people carefully and not take everything at face value. And that the people who are paradoxical, as Benedict Arnold proved to be, can be very dangerous, and that's what Benedict Arnold was. And he came very close to ruining the patriot cause by committing treason.
Jack, this has been a great conversation, and I've really learned a lot. Your book, God Save Benedict Arnold, The True Story of America's Most Hated Man. People can get that at any sort of booksellers, websites and things?
Yeah, it's available wherever books are sold. And I have a website. You can find sources on the website, jackkellybooks.com, and also sign up for my newsletter, which gives a little bit of history and information about my writing activities.
That's terrific. And what's your next project?
I'm actually working on a book about Tom Paine, who I think is another one of the really interesting characters of the Revolution. Has always been also a somewhat controversial figure. Is he really one of our founders? Had a fascinating life, and I'm focusing on his participation in the Revolution.
That's great. I'm looking forward to that, and we'll have to have you back on our podcast to have you tell us about that book. And as we approach the 250th anniversary of our nation's birth, I'm so glad that you are actively doing this research and sharing it with people so we can learn more, not just history buffs, but people who are interested in just good storytelling and characters of people and what makes people tick. What were they really about? Not what just has been passed on from generation to generation. Let's hear from people who've been doing great research and bringing history alive, keeping it alive, and making it new. So thank you for that. So Jack, I wish you all the best, and just keep doing what you do.
Well, thank you very much, James. It's really been a pleasure, and it's always good to talk to you.
Thanks, Jack. Have a great day.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your History, Your Story. You can connect with us on Facebook and YouTube at Your History, Your Story, or on Instagram and Twitter at YHYS Podcast. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or a story to tell. Be well, and God bless.